Are you wondering why there's a Star Trek episode in your feed on a Wednesday? Well, Purim is coming up, and I wanted to drop a special bonus episode for you. I speak with my friend Rav Elli Fischer about his journey from being a campus rabbi to being a writer and a translator. We speak about a very interesting article he wrote, but that's all just the setup for a very, very serious conversation about Purim Shpiels. My name is Yaakov Wolf, and this is a special bonus edition of Shark Tank. Rav Elli Fischer, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Yaakov, for having me.
You started your career as a campus rabbi in America, and you made Aliyah and transitioned also professionally to being a writer and a translator. And that wasn't exactly the smoothest transition. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah. After making a campus rabbi, I thought it was probably the most fun I ever had on a job. I was the rabbi at the University of Maryland. It was a blast, as you can imagine, right? Like part of my job was to, host a tailgate party in a sukkah. Like what could be, what could be more fun? And the students were great. This is the University of Maryland, 2004 to 2006, right when the community was starting to explode, right? If I were a different rabbi or a different kind of rabbi, I would take credit for the explosion. There are rabbis who did, oh yeah, I built this community. It's like, dude, the community built itself. You happen to be in the right place at the right time. That's always the case. But it was great. It was a phenomenal job. It was a phenomenal position. But like we made Aliyah. That was always the plan. It's hard to long term. It's hard to stay on campus, right? The kids are, you're not going to raise the kids across the street from Frat Row. Chabad does it, and I don't know how they do it, but it's we're not Chabad. We raise our kids in a community. In a physical community, not in a virtual community of Chabad people all over the world. I had ideas about like creating JLIC. This was through JLIC about creating JLIC stuff in Israel. We had a whole bunch of meetings at different universities. Israel wasn't really there yet. JLIC hadn't made as much enough of a name in the United States yet. It was still in its first or second generation there. Now you have JLIC in Israel. I think four different JLICs in Israel, and it's an amazing thing, and it's great that it is expanded here as it has. We were a little bit too early for that. It wasn't there yet. So, and I went through a very difficult transition. It was so hard. I was miserable for the first year. I was bouncing around in various, odd jobs, trying to create things, it was very difficult. My second year, I got a steady job, a full-time job at one of the seminaries, but it was clear by mid-year that this was not going to be my future. Even though we were dealing with students of the same age that we were dealing with in college, it was just a very different kind of mentality. And, the kids are the same age. And I would say that even the kids that are coming to Israel, for a gap year, I don't know if they're more mature or less mature than the 18-year-olds on college campuses, but 18-year-olds on college campuses are essentially empowered to be adults, right? There are very few rules on college campuses, or there are rules, but it's, they make their own decisions. Whereas in seminary, you're still talking about very much in loco parentis. And the students and it's expected that the students are taken care of, in a way that they're not taken care of on a university campus. So that was, I was used to treating 18-year-olds as adults, and then I came back to camp to seminaries, even if they weren't adults. I'm not saying that, but that's how the entire mode of the relationship. It all has to be coming from them. It all has to be it's an adult relationship. And then you get back to seminary, and it's very much not an adult sort of relationship. It's still very much a teacher-student relationship. And that's not what I wanted. So I tried. It had come up, I had been blogging for a few years just as my own creative outlet. In Israel, some of the early jobs that I had involved writing, translating and editing and things like that. And it turned out I had a knack for it. I was not formally trained to be a writer. Let me take that back. Did you go to YU? You didn't go to YU, right? You grew up here. You grew up in Israel. So I went to YU. I took one English composition course with anybody that at YU will recognize this name, with Professor Lee, Will Lee. It was English Comp 2. I think we started the semester, there were 30 people in the class. By the end of the semester, there were 6 people in the class, including somebody who I met in this class and is now one of my closest friends. And it was, he really put you through the ringer, right? He taught you how to write. And there were certain key principles of composition and key attitudes of how to write that I got from Professor Lee that, that guide me to this day. I mean, it's really, so it's a question of learning those principles, the principles of style, the elements of style. If you want to go, use Strunk and White. And I found out that I was good at it. And I found out that I was also good at translating, right? And translating is not just about one-to-one, this word means this and this word means this. It's about sort of digesting a message and then reproducing that message and trying to recreate that, the impact of the message in the target language. Okay? And so I found that, again, it depends on the kind of document, right? When you're trying to translate a Devar Torah, or you're trying to translate a legal document, or you're trying to translate an academic document, right? They're all different target audiences, and you're trying for different things. The principle is the same. You're not trying to create a translated document. You're trying to create a new document, a standalone new document that if somebody picks it up and reads it, they would not feel that it's translated, just generated for a different audience. So I found I was good at it. That second part of that second year after Aliyah, so this is starting, let's say, in around January 2000, I started doing translation on the side, and I just started taking whatever would come my way. I contacted all kinds of translation agencies. I was doing people's CVs. I was doing who knows what, all kinds of stuff just to get into just to create the habits of mind. I got a job editing a book. I had done some editing earlier when I was in Nicole and Yeshivat Har Etzion. I did some editing for the yeshiva, for the VBM. And then I also, and that's where I got some of my first work, right? Meaning they were having me translate and edit new series on the VBM. And then we went to, from there, it went to, I started building my own client base. And within a few years, I had enough of a client base and enough of a reputation that I could be on my own. And then over the years, that sort of refined. I developed a niche. So now most of my clients are it's halachic and academic Jewish. And I would say more now academic than halachic. As you know, I edited 10 volumes of Penina Halacha. I am no longer, it was always on a freelance basis. I was never an employee of Yeshivat Har Bracha, except for a couple of months that I was actually on the payroll. but it was always on a freelance basis, and it was and I'm no longer there, meaning it was time to move on. Yeah, so that's the
And
transition.
you mentioned that you started very early on blogging. How did that develop over the years? I'm sure the skills picked up through translating helped bolster the impact of your writing, your own personal creative expression. How did that develop over time?
It actually was the opposite. When I was a campus rabbi, blogging was a good outlet, right? Maryland, University of Maryland, it has a lot of milas, but it is not. It's not the most intellectual environment. When I was there, it was ranked amongst the top party schools in the United States, and I can attest that that's that designation. And I haven't sampled all the universities, but from the ones that I've seen, I was once I remember I was at a wedding. The chassan was from Maryland and the kala was from Columbia. And let me tell you, like the chassan's friends, they put away multiple bottles of hard whiskey at the chassan's dish and could still walk a straight line down the aisle. And the kala's friends had like a couple of shots and they're falling over themselves. Okay, so like I know that say what you want about Columbia, Maryland, which ones the Maryland kids could hold their liquor a lot better, and I would imagine that that's like practice makes perfect. So I needed more of that was the environment I was in. So I felt that I needed more of a creative intellectual outlet. Like if I have Chidushei Torah, like I didn't have very many students to share them with, and so I started the blog to talk about things that I wasn't necessarily talking to students about. Once I started to write for a living, that's when my blog started to tail off. That's when I stopped blogging because writing was writing was what I did all day for my job. It's no longer a leisure activity. Right. And I think that that's something that's, I don't know if this is typical of other people's lives, but, there are things that can start off as hobbies that can go from being hobbies to being part of the parnasa and vice versa. Right now, I give shiurim and shul as a hobby. Right, I give daf yomi several times a week. I give shiurim on a I don't know. I wouldn't say a regular like the daf yomi shiur is a regular basis, and then other things shiurim chaburas. I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 times a year in Modi'in or elsewhere. I still do scholar in residence gigs, and if any of your American listeners, hear that, scholar in residence gigs.
We'll put a link in the show notes to how to get in touch with you.
Yeah. So and that's I don't know, a few times a year, and that's that's where, but that's more of a hobby now. Learning is something that I do for leisure. Learning and teaching is not something that I do for. I don't have to prepare shiurim as professionally. So it's what's considered leisure and what I think it's good to be in a place where something that you're doing for fun can easily transition into something that you do for parnasa and vice versa. Something that you're doing for parnasa, right? Who wouldn't want to do something for parnasa that if the parnasa dries up there, they would continue to do it because it's enjoyable. It means that while the parnasa is there, you're actually enjoying what you're doing for a living.
And you reflected on this journey a little bit in an article that you wrote about comparing Israeli and American cost of living and professional choices within the modern Orthodox community in America and the Dati Levi community, modern Orthodox community in Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, this is sort of responding to the Pew report that came out in 2013, but really it had been percolating for a while before that. It's sort of everybody knew, at least then, that modern Orthodoxy, when we talk about specifically American modern Orthodoxy, that's where this was aimed. I don't know how many of your listeners would consider themselves American modern Orthodox, but like, mainline American modern Orthodoxy, right? Your New York area, Westchester County and Bergen County and Nassau County, right? Like are the three hubs. There was a very, very high cost of living, right? And that manifested itself in day school education. It manifested itself in cost of housing in very particular neighborhoods. And the surveys showed that this was, that this was reflected in reality. The people that identified as modern Orthodox tended to be sending their kids to day schools and high priced day schools, very expensive day schools, and living in these communities, and also earning enough to support that lifestyle. And so you had, and there was tremendous pressure to go into fields that where somebody could earn that kind of money, right? Meaning you're talking about something where you had to be guaranteed to have a household income, well into the six figures. Meaning, and I'm talking again, 10, 11 years ago, like $300,000-$400,000 at a minimum had to be the household income, maybe more, in certain communities. We can add, by the way, to that, we can add Montgomery County in Maryland, maybe a couple of other places. And people were talking about how this is forcing, kids, modern Orthodox kids, they're forced to sort of, if you want to maintain that lifestyle, you have to become a doctor, or you have to become a lawyer, or you have to go into finance and investments, and maybe a few other things like you can become an actuary or something like that. Maybe an accountant if you were really willing to put in the work to be in one of these these white shoe and so and people were talking about how that's like the kids that didn't want to do that or that couldn't do that, and there was sort of like a lesser tier was becoming a teacher or a mechanech, meaning it was somewhat acceptable, although if you would walk into a modern Orthodox synagogue and say by show of hands, how many people here want their child to become a rabbi or marry a rabbi, there were very few hands would have gone up. Who wants to have a kid who's a doctor or a lawyer? Every hand. And so there was a lot of talk, there was a lot of buzz about the unsustainability of this, the economic implications of this, that this is unsustainable, that you can't have an entire society that's built on, this level of income, right? And the interesting thing was, and this will sort of transition us into the next part of it. The interesting thing to me was that this discussion, it wasn't, and so the nail in the forehead, are you familiar with that sketch, The Nail in the Forehead? Okay. The nail in the forehead for that entire conversation was Aliyah. You weren't allowed to mention Aliyah in that context, right? Because Aliyah meant like, that was the nail. Like, wait, you can make Aliyah and you can send your kids to schools for, a lot cheaper. Sure, you're going to have to make it up with tutoring, but, and medical insurance is covered by the state. So yeah, you'll still struggle to make a living, but the basic necessities of, education and healthcare and stuff like that, will be, no, don't mention the nail. You can't mention the nail. We need to solve this here. We need to solve the tuition crisis here. We can't solve it by running away from it. Like, that's the nail. So, but for me, it was like, are those the only alternatives? Like, okay, so the kids that are not, that are falling out, where are they going? So some kids are opting out, to simplify it, some kids were opting out of the modern, sometimes some kids were opting out of the Orthodox, right? If you're not modern Orthodox, like, okay, you can, if you don't care about giving your kids a Jewish education, fine. Who cares? Go live wherever you want. Go to, or you can just do it on your own terms, right? You can have, an hour or two a day or an hour or two a week You don't have to live in these specific communities. You can, the world is your oyster. The other alternative is you can give up on the modern, right? You can move to Baltimore. You can move to Cleveland. You can move to Passaic. You don't have to be modern Orthodox. You can send your kids to, to more yeshivish day schools, and that's, and they'll get a good Jewish education. You're right. You might have to supplement some of the other things, but all in all, you're going to get, no, we can't do that because they don't believe in, and they'll give you like a whole list. Like they don't believe in this, and they don't believe it. They don't believe in the modern state of Israel, and they don't believe in educating women. That men and women are equal, and they don't believe in who knows what. Meaning, whether or not it's true, this was the excuse, right? Meaning, as I like to say, a modern Orthodox balabas is a guy who says, I'm not taking my kid to father and son learning because they don't include women. So instead, stays home and watches college football. Okay? Meaning, like, it's a type, right? It's a type of modern Orthodox. It's like, I don't want to overgeneralize, but that, I came up with that quip, Mishum Maisa Shahaya, right? That, yeah, you're right. In all else being equal, it wouldn't be father-son learning. It would be parent-child learning, right? Because that's so much more inclusive, because it means that any parent can learn with any child, and that's wonderful, right? It shouldn't just be father-son learning. But if the only show in town is father-son learning, are you going to deny that to your kid? That's the brass tacks. That's where the rubber hits the road, right? Do you think that Talmud Torah is important enough and compelling enough that even if Talmud Torah is being done in a context that isn't ideal to your mind, you will still take advantage of it because Talmud Torah is important? And then you'll work at the same time on creating other opportunities for Talmud Torah that will include other members of your family. That's where it is, right? But if the energy is coming from a place that you don't identify with, and you're not willing to take advantage of it, then I see that also with like pop-up minyanim, right? It's like, oh, we want to create a shul where we're going to be more this, and we're going to be more welcoming of this, and we're going to do more of that. And it's great, and it's wonderful, and all those things are great. But like at the end of the day, if you can't make a minyan for a weekday Ma'ariv, it's not a shul, it's a Shabbos minyan, right? I mean, there has to be something, right? And there has to be that core of energy, that core of commitment. I'm getting a little bit too far afield. My ADD has completely taken over.
You were speaking about the cost of living?
Oh, right. We started with cost of living, and people were unwilling to move to a modern Orthodox, out of a modern Orthodox community. Right. So that got me thinking, like, okay, so how much of what we do, how much of what we are is contingent? Meaning American modern Orthodoxy, or I would say American early 21st century, late capitalist modern Orthodoxy is a very peculiar formation, right? It is a type of Judaism, right? And the person that really, has been observing this and writing about this for decades is Alan Brill of Seton Hall University, who was teaching at YU when I was there, and I took a class with him. And he's the one, he started thinking, another one is another person who thinks this way very much is Rabbi Aryeh Clapper from Sharon, Massachusetts. And they're like, okay, this formation of American modern Orthodoxy and its institutions, its shuls, its schools, its what are its key features, and how does it generate buy-in, and how does it deal with attrition? But started thinking about it in ways that people in the community don't usually think about it, right? Meaning, think about it try to think about it as an outsider. Try to think about how this looks from the outside of contemporaries, or how would it look to somebody that lived 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago? Would it be recognizable? Would it be unrecognizable? And you start to realize that there are so many parts of there's so many components of our religious lives, our Jewish lives, that are sort of unexamined, and that it's important for any community to have people examining it, to hold a mirror to it. Right? An example, we talked about this the other day, and this is where I think artists come in, artists and writers. Go to a modern Orthodox chasana, or go to a chasana, a contemporary chasana. You'll have there's a pretty standard format, right? First of all, in terms of the material, we call it the material culture, the gowns are all going to look more or less, I'm not going to say more or less the same. God forbid that all wedding gowns look more or less the same, but they're all going to be recognizable as a wedding gown. The guys will be wearing something that's recognizable as a particular kind of formal wear, a suit or a tuxedo. Headgear will be recognizable either by the lack of hat or by the presence of a very particular kind of hat. The music will be familiar. The songs will be familiar. The flowers, the benchers, right? These are all things that are not necessarily if you think about, okay, how do you do a wedding? These are all the things that go into what makes it a wedding. The pictures, and obviously things come and go, right? You didn't have a videographer 40 years ago. Today, obviously you need to have a videographer. Even if you've ever picked up a sefer like Noah Gitzon Yosef, or the Minhagei Kila Kadosha Vermaiza from Rav Yos B'Shamish, right? Those from the 1600s, from the 1700s, Sifrei Minhagim. Right? There are all kinds of minhagim about chasanas, right? And they could get to a very particular. They could get very particular in terms of what the minhagim were, down to the menu for the Sheva Brachos, down to the day of the week that it happened, down to the time of day that it happened, down to what the Chassan wore, what the Kala wore. And there it was talking about things like the kinds of hats that they wore and the kinds of dresses that they wore, where they walked into the shul. Yes, in some of these minhagim, the chasanas took place in the shul. Which door they walked in from, very, very particular detail. So I would imagine, if you will, writing a Minhagei Kal Kadosh Woodmere or Minhagei Kal Kadosh Teaneck, okay? And you would have things like, okay, and once the photographers are, while the photographer is taking pictures of the family with the chassan and kala together, the guests are in a different room. First, the men daven mariv, the yesh noagim, that sometimes one or two women daven mariv, and there's always more than one mariv for the guys that missed the first mariv. And then they go and they have the first course. And during the first course, there's a lot of schmoozing. And then at the end of the photograph session, the band strikes up, and the chassan and kala's friends go over to a particular door where the chassan and kala are coming in, and they hold like these, decorative arches, and the band then plays the intro from the final countdown. The yesh noagim that they play the intro from Smoke on the Water, right? Or the yesh noagim that they play the intro for AC/DC's Back in Black, right? I was like, would that appear in the Sefer Minhagim? I don't know. Were the Minhagim that they had in Frankfurt 350 years ago, were they the same thing as the band playing Smoke on the Water or Back in Black today? I don't know. But the point is that, this is a pattern of our life. It's part of a pattern of our life, pattern of our community that we don't really examine it, and we don't really think about, when did this become a minhag? When did people start doing this? To what extent is deviation from this tolerated? Meaning, somebody was the first one to come up with back in black, but was that so obviously some variation is tolerated. But what if the husband and Kala were just like walk in and walk over to one of the tables and say hi everybody? It's like, what are you doing? You have to go out and come back in. Like we brought all the decorative arches. The band is going to strike up a tune. Like, you can't just walk in like that. It has to be a grand entrance, right? Like, where does it say it has to be a grand entrance? Like, no, we're spending so much money on this wedding. It has to be done perfectly. It has to be done right. It's like, why? Is it Allah? Show me in the Mishnah Brura where it says we have to like have a grand entrance. Like, it's not in the Mishnah. No, you're missing the point. Right? It's like, am I missing the point? Right? So when you start this is what I mean by holding up a mirror, right? And there are so many things. There's so much of what we do and who we are that and it's constantly in flux. It's constantly changing, but it's not changing in ways that are recognizable, or that are obvious. And so you think about like, okay, what, how do we think about these practices, and what do these practices say about our community and about our world and about our relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom and our relationship with the Torah, right? These are things that like we need to be examined. Right? So how are they examined? So one way that they're examined is through the Musar Shmuz, right? A successful mashgiach is picking up on these things and not talking about the obvious things, and it's not going to give Musar on the obvious things, but a good mashgiach will pick up on these unreflexive habits of mind, the things that we think about without even realizing that we're thinking about, or the things that we do without even realizing that these are the result of a particular formation in a particular time, in a particular place. So that's one, a mashgiach, or some sort of mashgiach-like figure, a rabbi, a teacher. And then the other people are the artists, right? The artists will be, the ones who will sort of recreate this mental map. And the artists are the ones that notice the details, right? That's what great art is. Great art is something that it's not just portraying a scene. It's portraying a scene, but drawing particular attention to the things that we wouldn't necessarily pay attention to, right? It magnifies certain things, and it shows certain things sometimes as being grotesque or as being ugly. Right, and that's part of the Musar. That's part of the or the cost of these things. Like if you do this, then in the background you'll see something that the consequence of it, right? The sort of the damage that's done in the wake of whatever this practice is.
We spoke about Rabbanim and Mashgichim and Mechanchim. You also mentioned artists and people who use art as a tool to reflect. But if you have just a regular balabas, he's a regular professional, what can he do to take part in that process? One of the things that I think about a lot is something like the Purim Shpiel, which I know in Kerem Biavne you were a big player in, and is something which still practiced in many communities, that regular people from the community use that as a vehicle. So can you start maybe with Purim Shpiels, but then maybe broaden the lens to talk about what a regular balabas can do to take part in that process?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, we talked about creativity as being holding up a mirror. I think the Shpiel, the Purim Shpiel, at least the way that it was, the way that it was practiced in a lot of yeshivas and in a lot of communities, is a form of satire or caricature to pick up on like particular tendencies and sort of take them to the extreme to show what the consequences of such a thing would be. What would that look like? And I think that very much is a way of holding up a mirror to society. I don't know if it's it occurs to me that the word spiel is very close to the word spiegel, right? A spiegel is a mirror, right? So a Purim Shpiel is also in some ways a Purim Spiegel. It's a mirror, right? It's a caricature, and a caricature is something that it highlights and makes grotesque certain details. And successful parody and successful satire doesn't stretch the truth too much, right? Meaning, if you don't get the base culture, you can't successfully parody that culture, right? If you think about, let's say, a pop cultural reference would be, Statler and Waldorf, the two old guys in the balcony on the Muppets. Okay, I think that those are great characters, not because ostensibly they're spectators of the show, but they're not really spectators of the show. They're also part of the show, right? And they're a vehicle for the show to sort of make fun of itself, right? And I think that a community sort of needs its Statler and Waldorf. Right now, we talked about Rabbanim and Mechanchim as sort of playing that role of Statler and Waldorf, and there's this broader class of people that do this for leisure, people that do this for fun, and I would call that the hawkers, right? And I'm using this term in a very specific way. And by the way, even to hawk is to it's to chew on something. It can't. One of its possible meanings is it's to chew on something, right? The people you're chewing on it, right? Chewing is necessary for digestion, right? You need to break it down to its component parts. You need to see what it's made of, right? You're the internal critic. And that can take a lot of so I think that one of the roles here, one of the roles, so first of all, I think it's, for those of us who enjoy it, it's really, really enjoyable. Like a good conversation, that the perfect conversation, I've used this line several times also mishum ma'aseh shehaya. I was once on a panel about 6 years ago in Toronto. I was on a panel together with Professor Chaim Seiman of Villanova University, who I was in Karen B'Yavna with. And we weren't the only panelists, and don't worry, it wasn't the manel. We weren't the only panelists, but we were, we were in conversation with each other, and there was a good amount of banter. And we were sitting in the front of, in front of a shul, in front of the Aron, and I realized, we could have been having that exact same conversation 25 years earlier, 30 years earlier, in the back of the base medrash at Karen B'Yavna. Rebbe would have come over and says, guys, shine, enough batala, get back to learning. Whereas now we're having, that conversation. We're sitting in front of the shul. They're calling us scholars in residence. They're paying us, and this is an event that's called, a night of learning. Right? So which is it? Where are we? Right? And I think that's the space that I want to talk about, that I think is worth occupying, right? The people that you're not just a cynic and a critic that's making fun of the whole thing, right? You're not somebody that's just either super intense, and you're not somebody that's living in a bifurcated world, right? Balabatim, we often see live in a bifurcated world. You have your religious world; it takes place in shul. That's where I learn. That's where I daven, and then I have my business life or my professional life where I'm at the firm and I'm doing what I'm doing there. And, I'm not violating anything in Shulchan Aruch, hopefully, but those are two separate realms. I wouldn't say that it's, I don't know if it's unhealthy, but it certainly doesn't work for everybody. I think that there's something to be said for living for living a life where those two sides, the religious side of your life and the professional side of your life, are in constant dialogue with each other. And in order to do that, there has to be a process of, here we get back to translation, but there has to be a process of translation of okay, well, we just learned in Bava Basra, what we just learned in Kiddushin, how does that translate? Meaning, if this goes against our contemporary sensibilities, right, and we need to examine that, why does it go against our contemporary sensibilities? How does it go against our contemporary sensibilities? Does that mean that our contemporary sensibilities need to be adjusted? Is it something that's just a function of, 2,000 years of world economic or social development, that what they were talking about in Kiddushin is just not part of the Metzias today, like literally part of the Metzias today. What is it, right? And in order to do that, you have to sort of, you have to create these sort of like almost caricatured images of like, let's say we tried to apply this Gemara or this, or this Machshava to the way things are today. Right? Would it work? Right? And you play out scenarios, and then like you discuss those scenarios. And so you end up inventing these fictions of a world where, I don't know, where dinim that haven't been practiced, or dinim that have really been, to take an example, the Gemara talks about, the minimum size of a house that a husband has to provide for his wife, and it's something like 8 square amos, right? So it's like, obviously that doesn't work today, right? 8 square amos is, I think my mamad is bigger than that. My shed is bigger than that. So it's like, obviously, so that's, the Metzias is changed, right? All of the questions, questions about schirus, right? Today there are rental contracts that provide for all kinds of contingencies, and there are renter rights, and and there are employee rights, and there are all kinds of things that sort of like either they make these halachos implicit, meaning we're, whether or not we want to, it's already there, or just no longer part of our reality. But like when you start to put together, like, okay, when trying to apply, let's say what the Torah thinks about ribbis, right? Where when the Torah talks about ribbis, it's talking about literally a predatory investment practices, predatory lending practices that could very easily result in enslavement of the party in debt, right? Debt can result in enslavement and indentured servitude. This is what the Torah is talking about, right? So explicitly talking about, right? It's like, and it says, and he won't be sold as an eved because you'll lend him without ribbis, right? So you start hocking around about like, okay, right? How does ribbis work? Does ribbis work with in context of we never otherwise would have thought about? Can you ingest? Now we know that there's inflation, right? And we're talking about currency that doesn't retain its value, right? So can I build the inflation rate into ribbis? Is that considered ribbis? If I say, right, if I say I'm going to give you a small value loan, but I'm going to peg it to, I don't know, the price of gold, the price of silver, or a certain basket of consumer goods, the consumer pricing index. How does that work? Right? What if there's a place where there are multiple currencies? What if, and I think that this actually came up in the early 1920s. I found a manuscript tshuva from Reb David Tzvi Hoffman that I have yet to find somebody who can read it and understand it, because it's written in like the old German fracture script, and it's intensely halachic.
If any of our listeners want to help with the fractured German, they can reach out.
There's Fraktur is like a certain type of script that went out of style in Germany's in like the 1930s, and I think from what I can make out, he's writing about the halachos of ribbis during a period where Germany was experiencing hyperinflation, and that's a great shaila, right? I borrowed 10,000 marks from you in the morning. In the evening, the loaf of bread that cost 1,000 marks now costs 5,000 marks. I pay you back the same 10,000 that I borrowed from you. Nobody's ever going to lend under those circumstances, right? How does that work? So can you peg it to another currency? Let's say, okay, we're in Germany. We can have, I don't know, whatever currency was in the Netherlands or Switzerland or France, peg it to that. I'm borrowing francs from you. I'll pay you back in francs because that's a much more stable currency. Is that mutter even? Right? Because that means that I'm going to be borrowing, the currency here is the Reichsmark, and I'm borrowing from you, or the Deutschmark. I'm borrowing from you 1,000. I'm paying you back 1,000, but that 1,000 is worth 100 from when I borrowed it. and nobody's ever going to lend because everybody knows that inflation is going crazy, right? So in order to do that, you have to be hacking around about history, and you have to be like, you have to know all of these things, and it's a question of like, you can't be like, no, you can't. It has to be the local currency. Like it's easy to answer the shaila by saying, no, you borrowed 1,000, you pay back 1,000, right? Like the what is it, the yoter pri or oto davar? It's not oto davar, it's yoter pri, right? It's that's the unexamined way of thinking about it. But like when you're trying to apply it to a social reality, Hinami, a social reality from 100 years ago, you need to think about it in a very different way, right? And I think that it's only the people that are like, okay, you're learning the Gemara, you're learning the fifth parak of Bava Metzia, and then you're like, yeah, but how does that work with hyperinflation? And how does that work in an environment where we know that that governments want inflation? Right? Inflation at this point in history, inflation is pretty much planned, right? Because every single government in the world is in debt, and one of the ways to lower debt is through inflation, right? It's like, because I print more money, the money is worth less, but now I can pay off my bills. And so, and how does that impact the way we think about like the very basic, I'm going to lend some money to a brother who's in need, right? And and do we think, and is it how we think about it as an individual? Like think about we talk about a free loan society today as a gemach, right? So there, you're not going to charge interest on a gemach, right? Because you see it as an act of chesed. But the loans that it's talking about that are, that you're not allowed to charge interest on, were fundamentally an act of tzedakah and an act of chesed. Somebody's going through a rough patch and they need to get through it, so you lend them some money, right? You're not talking about, modern banking practices, and you're not talking about modern, like home mortgage loans, right? Which it's a very different kind of thing, right? I'm taking out a loan, but as I pay off this loan with interest, I'm also building equity, and hopefully the property value will rise. So it'll be, something that it's this loan that actually enables me to build personal wealth. It's a very different way of thinking about things. Now, halacha eventually does have to process that, right? But ideally, when you're learning these sugyas, right, you should be applying them and running them through, working them through contemporary society, contemporary reality as we're going through them, right? And so you get a million different issues that you can end up talking about that aren't exactly halacha, but don't exist without halacha, and aren't exactly bittul Torah, even though you can't really do, even though you can't do them without sort of going far afield from, what's on the text and the page in front of you.
One of the things you spoke about was a person can sometimes feel their life is bifurcated, their Talmud Torah, their religious life is maybe dry, maybe not so fulfilling. And you mentioned in that context the role that reflection plays in making your life a little bit richer, a little bit broader. Can you zoom in on that a little bit?
So I'll answer with two things. One is a famous letter from Rav Hutner about, somebody asked him that he feels like he's leading a double life, right? That he has his professional life and he has his religious life, and it's actually like in the Igros Uksavim, like it has in English, double life. And Rav Hutner talks about how you shouldn't be living a double. You're not leading a double life. You're leading a broad life, and you should lean into that. And you should figure out a way that you need to make your life whole. Right? You're living a single broad life. You're not leading a double life. Right? And Rav Hutner goes on. I don't remember exactly what he says, but he sort of changes the attitude and says, okay, so now the question is like, so how do we? If you don't feel like you're living a double life, fine, great. If you do feel like you're living a double life, then you have to ask, how do I sew those pieces together, right? How do I turn it into something that's a single life? Another vignette or a joke that I'll throw in here is one that I heard from a friend of mine, Ari Weintraub. A guy, Acharmei Esrim, he goes to he gets judged to a certain amount of time in Gehenna. And in Gehenna, there's a base medrash, and people are sitting and learning. He's like, all right, fine. So it's not too bad. I'll sit and learn. Finds a chavrusa in the base medrash of Gehenna, and he sits down, and they learn. They learn for a good hour and a half. And then he says, you know what? I'm going to go get coffee. And immediately a malach appears and hands him a cup of coffee. And says, here in Gehenna, there's no coffee room. We bring the coffee to your seat. Anybody that's been in his matter is like, guess like why that's Gehenna, right? After like this session, right, where he's like real, like it's intense, like you want to step away. You need to sort of unpack it or unwind it, or, you know, it's an intense experience. Talmud Torah can be a very intense experience, and it should be a very intense experience, you know, and sometimes you need to reflect on it. You need to digest it, right? And, you know, and the coffee room is the place where that gets done, right? And every yeshiva Purim Shpiel has a thing about how, like, there's 4 guys in the base medrash and 50 guys in the coffee room, and like, fine, we get it, but like but it's an important part of the culture, right? That you need that sort of unwinding, and in the schmoozing in the coffee room might be about what we were just learning, just in a more low key, less intense, more detached sort of way.
You're saying that that's the glue that bridges the intense Talmud Torah with everything outside?
I think that that's part of what lets you internalize it, that lets you digest it. And I think that the goal is for it to sort of percolate into who you are personally. Right? And I think that you need that. And I think you need to let that happen. I think you need that. I think that it's not natural for that to happen just through Talmud Torah. I think that, you know, this is what it means when we talk about how the Torah shapes personality, right? It's not just the learning. It also, you have to let it filter into the personality, right? And that's what's going to connect it to the rest of life. And I think that the things that can facilitate that are, yes, art can facilitate that. And I think that sometimes even satire, caricature, or parody can help us digest the results of this attempt to sort of, you know, bring the Torah into our lives. Right? Are we doing it right, or does it come out looking grotesque?
Rav Elli Fischer, thank you so much for joining us and for all of your wonderful insights that you share with us today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Start Take. If you're still listening at this point, that means that you've enjoyed. Please take a moment to give us a 5-star review, make sure that you're subscribed, and share this episode with a few friends. I want to thank our production team, Yoni Schwartz, Yitzhak Schmidman, and Yossi Book. Until next week, keep on steiging, Chevra.